What up, black? Hold your head wherever you at. On the floor from the cops with wings on your back. That's
Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to yet another video. This time, yet again, regarding college football. And this is the one I've been working on for several weeks at this point. Well, I guess you could say the series I've been working on, which is my top 15 power rankings, you could say, for college football. Now, I'm still not finished because, at first I was just going to do top 10, but then I was like, why would I just do a top 10? I got to do more than 10. So I decided on 15. And, you know, I'm still not done with the top 10, but hopefully I will get 10 through 5 out a lot quicker than it took me to get, you know, 15 through 11 out. But nonetheless, as we're only doing 15, there will be some people a little upset at who is not in here. So, honorable mention to Texas. If you watched my Texas team spotlight video, you would have known that I had them ranked at 16, and that may draw a little anger because of who I have right here. At number 15, I have Kansas State. Now, if you are upset at the fact that I have Kansas State ahead of Texas, you must have not watched my Texas video, because if you get angry at that, you are getting mad at the wrong person. I think Texas is going to win double-digit games and possibly go to the playoff. So don't call me a Texas hater or anything like that. Go watch the video. But Kansas State is the defending Big 12 champions, and I think they deserved a spot in the top 15, even though I will admit Kansas State is the only team in this entire top 15 power ranking that I do not believe can win the whole thing. And I do think Texas can. So take that for what you will. But let's go right into the video, y'all. Number 15, I have Kansas State. Last season, finishing 10-4. At one point, they got as high as the ninth best team in the country, and I believe they began the season unranked. So a very good journey for Kansas State last season, with their longest win streak being 4 games. And let's take a look at what last season consisted of. I think, a 40-12 win over Missouri right there. I think that kind of shocked a lot of people that a Big 12 team, especially a Big 12 team that was unranked at the time, could just dog walk an SEC team like Missouri. The Tulane game, I'm sure at the time, a lot of people kind of were mocking Kansas State because remember, last season, Tulane went, 2-12, before this most previous season. So that was probably a really shocking loss at the time. But knowing what we know now, in hindsight, we realized Tulane last season was a very good team. So that's not as bad of a loss as it looks on paper. And then obviously the big upset against Oklahoma is what put Kansas State on the map and began their streak of being a ranked team, which they did not uh, lose a grip of for the entire season. Then an impressive win over Texas Tech. If you're not aware, Texas Tech was a very good team last season, very explosive offense. So that's a big win for Kansas State in conference. Then a close, narrow win over Iowa State, and they eventually did drop that first game against TCU. At this point, TCU was a very good team. They had already knocked off undefeated Kansas, and TCU had a lot of hype surrounding them. So not a bad loss by any means. Then just the demolishment of Oklahoma. That was embarrassing for Oklahoma State, being a top 10 ranked team at the time. And at this point, week 9 of the season, giving Kansas State 2 top 10 wins and just completely dominating the state of Oklahoma last season. And then you had the close loss to Texas. This was Texas's only ranked win of last season, if I believe. And we all know that Texas was a very good team. So again, not a bad loss, if you ask me. And then they began their streak of just dominating the Big 12 the rest of the season, blowing out Baylor, putting up 48 on West Virginia, 47 on Kansas. And then finally, they got their rematch against TCU. Number 10 versus number 3, they beat TCU in a very, very good Big 12 championship game. Becoming the Big 12 champions, I thought at the time knocking TCU out of the playoffs, but they managed to sneak in there. And then you had the Sugar Bowl against Alabama. Look, I don't care what anybody says. I think this was a bit of a mismatch. I'm not entirely sure how the bowl games get put together and all that. I would have liked to see Kansas State play someone a little closer to their level than Alabama last season. But hey, obviously they lost Alabama. But let's get into, well, actually, before we get into the team stats, just a very good season for Kansas State. And I feel like a lot of people really just, I mean, they had three. Look at this. They had three top 10 wins last season. Now, you could say all three of those games were against Big 12 teams. But I mean, how many Power 5 schools did they play outside the Big 12? Tulane, Missouri, and Alabama. I mean, they lost to a very good Tulane team, dog walked Missouri, and lost to Bama. So I mean, all they had on their schedule really was Big 12 opponents, and they dominated the Big 12. So I can't really discredit them for beating the good teams that they played. So that's why I have Kansas State in the top 15, really. It's just three top 10 wins. And I mean, if they don't play Bama in their bowl game and they play a team more on their level, I think they win that game. And the talk around Kansas State is a lot different right now. Let's look at their team stats and what they were, you know, what they laid their hat on per se as a team. A very good running attack, obviously behind Deuce Vaughn. They had multiple quarterbacks last season. Adrian Martinez went down. I'm not sure what. I think it was at the Oklahoma game, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, they were not a team that threw the ball a lot. Only, 93rd in the country. But they were able to run the ball down a lot of teams' throats. 32 points per game, 1.5 sacks allowed. Offensively, really nothing surprising. They did not turn the ball over, which lends into why they were such a good, or well, I guess them being such a good running football team explained why they didn't turn the ball over much. They did not put the ball in harm's way through the air that often. And then defensively, again, middle of the pack in a lot of things. 29th in points allowed is a very good stat for Kansas State. Did not get after the quarterback a whole lot, which hopefully is something that can change. But as we will get into soon, with the players they lost, that seems a little hard to foresee. So this is really just impressive because they weren't really amazing at anything. They didn't really excel at anything. 15th in rushing yards, 12th in turnovers, and I mean 29th in points allowed. You would not expect a team that's that average, I guess you could say, across the board to win 10 games and have three top 10 wins, but Kansas State did. Next up, let's take a look at their key losses. Obviously, Adrian Martinez. We will get into why I don't think this is as big of a loss, but obviously he was a good player for them. When he was in there, their offense was very explosive. He made a lot of plays using his legs and through the air, but he only started around 8 games. I mean, like I said, he dealt with a lot of injuries. It was kind of back and forth between him and Will Howard, but that is, I think, a big loss for them. Obviously, Deuce Vaughn, best player on this team, most important player. I would compare Deuce Vaughn, or the Kansas State losing Deuce Vaughn, to Texas losing Bijan, except I do think Texas has enough weapons around them to kind of make up for that loss a little easier than Kansas State can make up for Deuce Vaughn, especially losing Malik Knowles as well, their top receiver from last season. Cade Warner as well, and this is what really hurts. I mean, Felix Anudike-Uzomah, 8.5 sacks last year, by far the most on the team. He was their best defensive player. So you lose your most important offensive player, you lose your quarterback, lose your number one receiver, lose your most important defensive player, and then look at their secondary. Josh Hayes, Drake Cheatham, Julius Brents. Kansas State lost a lot of players at a lot of key areas. So just off that, and the fact that they already weren't, they were middle of the pack in a lot of team stats last season, it is not looking good at this point for why I have them in the top 15. But let's get into what they do have, at least offensively still. Will Howard, I do think he will be a better quarterback next season than Adrian Martinez was last season. I think when he took over, I mean, he did beat TCU in the bowl game. He looked, or not the bowl game, the Big 12 championship. He looked very good. Treshaun Ward from Florida State is a massive get. A lot of people are just going to write off this Kansas State rushing attack in the absence of Deuce Vaughn. But Treshaun Ward and DJ Giddens, a freshman from last season, I think at least combined, obviously individually, neither of these guys are going to be Deuce Vaughn. But combined, I do think Kansas State, and I do expect Kansas State to still rush for over 200 yards a game because I still think these two guys are talented enough to at least combine for that. And as far as the weapons they still have, they need guys to step up. Phillip Brooks is a big retention from last season, as well as Ben Sinnott. I think he was a preseason second team All Big 12. And then Keegan Johnson, a transfer from Iowa, injured last season. But look at 2 years ago, almost 20 yards a catch at Iowa. At Iowa, 20 yards a catch, damn near. That is very impressive. Something to keep an eye on. So while I don't expect this Kansas State offense to be, I guess you could say, any better than last season. I don't really think they need to be. I think they did what they did. They won close games. If they can just maintain a good rushing attack, and I mean they have a lot of room for improvement as far as the passing game is concerned. I think they can get better offensively, which would, help them very much try and repeat as Big 12 champions. Defensively, though, they retain Brandon Mott, 6 sacks, their second leading sack leader from the previous season. The secondary leaves a lot to be desired. They need Jacob Parrish to step up, a freshman last season, if I'm not mistaken. Their linebacking core is strong. Khalid Duke is going to move to defensive end, I think I read. So between him, Brandon Mott, hopefully you can get after the quarterback more than they did last season. Linebackers between Daniel Green, Austin Moore, it's not bad. They weren't a horrible defense last season, but I don't really think, the defensive side of the ball is what wins Kansas State games. They try and outscore their opponents, and hopefully they can force more turnovers as a defense than they did last season. I think that would help a lot as well. So that wraps up Kansas State. Moving on to number 14, I got Notre Dame. And quite frankly, I think we all know that this kind of revolves around them getting Sam Hartman because the rest of the team last season, well, let's put it this way. They started out as the fifth ranked team in the country. Was that a mistake by the playoff committee? I would say so, or not what the AP poll, whoever puts those together. That was a bit of a mistake. Obviously, we know how they got unranked. Horrible start to the season, but they did finish incredibly strong, even putting together a 5-game win streak at one point. Let's get right into it. We all know how that game against Ohio State went, and quite frankly, one of the better games played against Ohio State in hindsight. Only holding them to 21 points per game, but we know the Notre Dame offense struggled mightily last season. And then the Marshall game, that was craziness. I mean, the pick six at the end of the game, that was pandemonium. And look at this. From ranked number 5 to number 8, they fell completely off the map. And they did not get back ranked until week 11. They got the death penalty from the AP poll after that loss to Marshall. But let's look at what they did. Let's look at this massive stretch from week 3 to week 12. They beat Cal. Close game. I was hoping they lost that game as well because that would have just been hilarious. Then they beat North Carolina. I thought North Carolina was going to come in and dominate. They put up 32 points, but Notre Dame offense. Now, you could say that was just a product of North Carolina having the worst defense in college football last season, and that's a possibility, but still, nonetheless, a good win over UNC. And then a close win over top 16 BYU. So you can see they're kind of right in the ship, right? They're getting back on track, and then they lose to Stanford. At this point, I'm sure a lot of people realize that their season was over, and it was. They're not in any playoff talks after that loss, but they still had a couple big wins left in them. Obviously, massive win over UNLV, and then they beat Syracuse handedly. Syracuse had a lot of hype. They started off undefeated last season, if I'm not mistaken. They beat them pretty easily, and then the massive win over Clemson. I don't really like Clemson. That was very fun watching DJ Uiagalelei throw pick sixes and, just Clemson get dog walked versus Notre Dame. That got them back ranked, thankfully. Well, not thankfully. I don't really care that they were ranked again, but that got them back ranked. They almost lose to fucking Navy. What a season from Notre Dame it was. And then they just 44-0 Boston College. And then a loss to USC. But, I mean, people don't really talk about it. They played number 2 Ohio State, number 4 Clemson, number 6 USC, and they didn't really – it's weird. It's like I guess you could say they played to their competition last season with the games like Navy, Stanford, Marshall, Cal. But I mean, they hung in there versus a lot of, top six teams last season. And yeah, obviously they lost to USC, but it's so weird. It's tough to explain Notre Dame last season. And then they beat South Carolina in the Gator Bowl when South Carolina was red hot, coming off wins versus Clemson and versus Tennessee. So how do you summarize last season for Notre Dame? They started off horribly, but I think you could say they finished incredibly strong while still having bad losses in there. So I don't know how I'd grade it. I don't know what I'd say about it, but let's take a look at the team stats and what held them back. Obviously, offensively, they could not figure out quarterback. It was bad. It was confusing. I mean, Tyler Buckner sucked. Drew Pine was better, but still, I mean, 60th in yards per game, 98th in passing yards a game. And I mean, they could run the ball, but I mean, still, when everybody knows you can't pass, it just makes it tougher on yourself. Somebody's fucking got shot or something outside. 42nd in points per game. That's kind of impressive. I would not have thought, just looking at the stats, that Notre Dame put up over 30 points a game last season, but they did. 1.62 sacks allowed, not great, not bad. And then 18 turnovers. Well, obviously, we understand that was a problem for them. But defensively, I think these stats are even kind of skewed, taking a look at how bad their offense was. I mean, 22nd in yards per game, 23rd in passing yards allowed, running, I mean, 37th, top 50 across the board, or top 40 across the board, except for takeaways, which they struggled to get last season. If you lose the turnover margin battle over a season, you expect to struggle at certain points. But then, I mean, 2.92 sacks, tied for 16th in there. Notre Dame had a lot of positives on the defensive side of the ball last season. So, I mean, like this entire slide, it really just makes it tougher to summarize what they were as a team last season. And it makes it even tougher when you realize all the changes that they made as far as personnel. Let's get into what they lost. Obviously, I mean, similar to Kansas State, I mean, I think Michael Mayer and Logan Diggs were easily the two most important, weapons on that offense last season. They lost both of them. Isaiah Foskey on defense, without a doubt, their best defensive player. Over 10 sacks. They lost him as well. Lorenzo Styles, I mean, just look at the yards they lost last season on a struggling offense. What's that, 1,800? Like 2,200 yards lost, 16 touchdowns between those three players on the left. They lost their center, lost their kicker, and then defensively, two DBs and three of their front seven. I mean, they lost, 16 and a half sacks right there as well. So they have a tall task on their hands in terms of just replacing talent. Let's look at what they have currently on offense. I brushed, or what's it called? I talked about it earlier. Sam Hartman at quarterback completely changes the dynamic of this team. If they don't get Sam Hartman, they're probably not in my top 20. With him, it's a game changer. Even without Logan Diggs, I think Audric Estime and Chris Tyree is more than enough to put together a good rushing attack. Joe Alt, obviously, one of the best offensive linemen in the country. Let's talk about the wide receivers. Who is going to step up on this team, finally getting a good quarterback? Who benefits the most? I think the transfer out of Virginia Tech, Caleb Smith, coming from the ACC along with Sam Hartman, I think he stands, at least at this point, to be their number one receiver. But Jaden Thomas, as a freshman last season, I think showed flashes. Deion Colzie, I mean, if you average over 20 yards a catch with Drew Pine and Tyler Buckner at quarterback, you have my attention. And then Braden Lindsey with over 300 yards last season. I mean, before Caleb Smith, it was looking rough. But with Caleb Smith as the, kind of lockdown number one, it makes it a little easier to see a path where, okay, this is a team that can definitely throw the ball now. And then defensively, we talk about how do you replace the loss of Isaiah Foskey. Well, getting Javante Baptiste from Ohio State, I think that's a big get. I think that's a very big get. He had 4 sacks last season, and then you have a couple guys. Their linebacking core is very strong, very, very strong. Their secondary, Benjamin Morrison is a preseason All-American, if I'm not mistaken, 6 picks last season. Very impressive. I think the strength of this team is their front seven. Overall, they're a very well-rounded defense, not a lot of flaws. I mean, this was their strength last season, right? I think at this point we kind of expect Notre Dame to have a good defense. That's more of the same this year. The real question is, can the offense hold up their end of the bargain? And if they do, I mean, we know who they play every year. It's never an easy schedule for Notre Dame. So can they win more than one of their big games next season? That will really determine how good of a team this can be, and can they take care of business? You can't lose to Marshall. You cannot lose to Stanford if you want to have any chance of being viewed as one of the best teams in the country. Moving on. We have Clemson. I have Clemson at 13. I would have to check. I'm not sure. This is probably the lowest that anybody has had them ranked to start the season in a very long time. And some of you may be very upset at this, but quite frankly, it was a disappointing season last year. That's not arguable. In a very weak ACC, they started off in the top 5, ranked 4th for a very long time. Even got up they were up at 4th. So the lowest they were was 13th last season at any point. I have them starting out at 13th. Is that fair? Is that discrediting them a little bit? I don't think so, because it's a worse team than what they started the season with last season. So I think it's more than fair. But they did rattle off a 8-game win streak. Let's get into it. So like I said, top 5 for a long time. Let's break it down. Just look at the trash cans they had to open up the season. Georgia Tech blowout, Furman blowout, Louisiana Tech blowout. Wake Forest came to town, and this was an impressive win. If you would have told me, well, I mean, I don't have to use that type of analogy. I would not have thought at any point that Clemson would win a game by putting up 50 points and getting into a shootout with another team. I would not have thought that possible, but that's what they did. Shout out to them. And let's look at their next 3 games. I mean, so ranked win against Wake Forest, ranked win against NC State, good defense, put up 30 points. Massive blowout over Boston College, 31 points. And then another big win against Florida State, 34 points. The first 7 weeks of the season, it's looking like their top 4, top 5 ranking is justified. I mean, hell, even though DJ had struggled to this point at certain games, they've put up at least 30 points every game the first 7 weeks of the season. And then after another big win over Syracuse, which looks scary at times, they'd have 3 ranked wins, albeit similar to Kansas State, all over the ACC opponents, but still 3 ranked wins and a rolling offense, at least statistically, through the first 8 weeks of the season. Things are looking good. It's looking up like Clemson is going to make the college football playoff, and then Notre Dame happened. They got spanked. They got punished. They got called bad words against Notre Dame, and everything went to hell. Their offense got exposed. DJ got exposed, and then they came back versus Louisville, Miami. Again, just dominating the ACC as Clemson usually does. Then South Carolina, a massive, massive loss. This was in the height of South Carolina and what they were able to pull off last season, just upsetting top 10 teams left and right. Still, a 1-point loss. It wasn't the worst thing in the world, which is why they only dropped by 1 in the AP poll. Then, yet again, dominating the ACC. They went undefeated last year in ACC play. How do you judge that compared to what happened in the Orange Bowl, getting blown out by Tennessee's backup quarterback? How do you weigh this? They went undefeated in conference play, but you could say the 3 best out-of-conference opponents that they played, they lost all 3 of those games. I would say that the ACC was probably the weakest conference last season. Clemson being the best out of the worst, they dominated that. Credit to them, not taking anything away. They did what they were supposed to do in conference, but when they had to play a team out of conference that was good, they lost. I think, I'm just stating the obvious there, but they got exposed in out of conference play. It's more than fair to say that. Taking a look at their offense, they were not top 29. I mean, in anything. 30th in points scored. Quite frankly, I think we would all say that's disappointing. Passing yards a game for Clemson, 66th, unacceptable. Rushing yards per game, 47th. 56th in sacks allowed, not great. 22 turnovers, 103rd, unacceptable. A lot of things across the board offensively for Clemson are not where they hold themselves to standards-wise. And then defensively, I think the idea is that well, yeah, Clemson's offense struggled last season, but they had a top 10 defense to make up for it. No, they weren't top 10 in anything except for sacks per game, which they were 10th. Credit to them. That's a very important thing to be top 10 in. Rushing yards per game, yes, they were 13th. Good for them. Struggled against the pass. Struggled mightily against the pass. 28th in yards per game, 23rd in points per game. If this was a team like Texas, like Kansas State, TCU, yeah, you'd take all these numbers. These are very good numbers for them. For Clemson, this is disappointing. This is not acceptable. They were not a top 20 defense last season. As difficult as that is to believe for some people, Clemson was not top 20 offensively or defensively. So how do I have them ranked 13th? Well, it's kind of just based off their reputation, kind of based off the fact that they still went undefeated in conference play, even though on paper and out of conference they didn't stack up. I have to take into account the fact that they still are liable to dominate their competition in conference. Key losses for them. I pondered whether or not to even put DJ on here. I am a DJ whatever hater. I do not believe in him as a quarterback, and I was very annoyed whenever Clemson fans stuck up for him in games that he played horribly, because there were multiple games that I feel like he was mainly to blame for their shortcomings, and they stuck up for him. But still, 3,000 total yards, 29 touchdowns. Hey, that's more than I thought he would have had. Joseph Nada, wide receiver, Davis Allen, tight end, not major losses, I think, but we'll get into why I think those are more than just, whatever replaceable pieces for them. Jordan McFadden on offense, the offensive line, 2,500 snaps played. They lost him. Lost their kicker, who has only missed one extra point in his career to that point. And then defensively, 4 members of their front 7. That same front 7 that was 10th in the country in sacks, they lost 4 of those guys. That, I think, is the main thing here. Defense is what they hung their hat on, and they lost a lot in that front 7. Let's get into what their offense is comprised of, though, for at least this season. Now, I want you guys to take a look at this before I say anything. Just take a look at this. Is this the offense of a top 13 team? No. Very simple answer. This is not a dominant offense. This is not an offense that will strike fear into any opponent's hearts. Outside of Will Shipley, they're not a good offensive team. They weren't last season. And unless you're a Clemson fan and you have to believe this, I don't think they're going to be a good offensive team next season. Well, with that being said, I think Will Shipley will continue to dominate. I think he's a top 10 running back in college football. And for any people that think Phil Mafah is better, because I found multiple people that believe Phil Mafah is the best running back in Clemson. Stay off the fentanyl, please, because you're not living in this reality. If you think Phil Mafah is the better player of the two, Will Shipley dominated college football. Without him, they probably would have been a 5-loss team instead of a 3-loss team. With that being said, Cade Klubnik, one of the most important players in college football next season. Similar to a Carson Beck situation, except he does not have nearly the level of talent around him as Carson Beck has. Not a knock on Carson Beck, it's just the reality. His job is going to be made a lot easier because of his defense and his weapons. Cade Klubnik does not have that luxury. He has to win Clemson games next season, point blank. He has to elevate the talent around him, point blank. Is that a tall task? Yeah. Is it a little unfair expectations to put on a new quarterback? Yeah. That's just what he has to deal with. Tough shit. Only 100 pass attempts last season, and let's call a spade a spade. He was not impressive last season whatsoever. I don't care if he beat UNC, if he beat whoever. I was not impressed. I don't think most people were impressed. And unless you are a Clemson fan and you have to believe that he will be a good quarterback, unless you're that, I don't know how you could say this guy is going to lead Clemson to the playoffs, lead them to being a top 5 team, top 6 team, nothing like that, because I don't believe that. Look at his weapons. And another thing, the same people, I'll say it's 50-50, the same amount of people that said DJ lost them games, and DJ was the problem with the entire offense, as well as the offensive coordinator, Street, or whatever his name was. There were an equal amount of people who said the wide receivers couldn't catch, wide receivers were letting him down, DJ that is, offensive line couldn't block, offensive line was letting DJ down. It was 50-50. So I think both sides were right. Wide receiver room for Clemson last season wasn't good. Was not good at all. I mean, I didn't even put the fact that they lost Justin Ross on here, but they lost him as well. I mean, Antonio Bo Collins, fucking. One second, let me make sure I'm right here. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, we're good. My bad. Looking at the wrong shit. What was I talking about? Okay. The same people saying that DJ was the problem, but there were an equal amount of people saying that the offensive line, the wide receiver core, was not up to par. Both sides were right. The wide receiver room for Clemson is not good. It is still not very good. Offensive line was not good. They lost one of their players, Jordan McFadden, to the draft. They lost several weapons, Davis Allen, Justin Ross, Nada to the NFL. So they're left with the leftovers from a not good offense, and Dabo Swinney does not go to the transfer portal to shore up any holes. They are just hoping that the players left over with a new offensive coordinator, I believe the TCU offensive coordinator is now at Clemson, they just believe that they're going to improve massively. And that's what they need. They need massive improvement to beat these out-of-conference opponents and beat a new and improved ACC. I don't think it's going to happen. I just don't think they have the talent offensively to lead them to being one of the best teams in college football next season. Defensively, though, I think it's another story. They are much better defensively than they are offensively, and that goes back to last season as well. I mean, let's talk. I already said they lost a lot in their front seven. What do they have left? Well, they have one of the best linebacking cores in college football. That is undeniable. I think. Tyler Davis coming back, that's a massive get. Jeremiah Trotter Jr. and Barrett Carter are dynamic. They are good in across the board. They can cover all three levels. They are amazing players. I think they are both first round caliber linebackers, and their secondary is talented as well. I like their safeties. I like Toriano Pride and Nate Wiggins. I think this team, I mean, Clemson is a team that you can pencil in as being one of the better defenses in college football. Even though they were not that last season, I expect them on paper to be a top 20 defense this season. Even if they are, though, like I said, the reason I have Clemson outside the top 10, outside the top 12 is their offense isn't good. And their defense is going to have to overcompensate. And you can't expect a defense to win you games when you play teams like they're going to play this season. So I think Clemson at 13 is very fair. Maybe I could be proven wrong, but unless Cade Klubnik comes out and is one of the 10 best quarterbacks this season, I don't think Clemson is going to be a top 10 team this year. Moving on. Number 12, we got Utah. The back-to-back Pac-12 champions against all odds, I could say. Nobody has expected big things out of Utah, and you could say me putting them at 12 to start the season is a little disrespectful, but I think this is just the story of what happens with Utah. They get placed outside the top 10 over and over, and then they have to work and claw and crawl to prove people wrong each year. Maybe they do it again. Let's talk about last season. 10 wins, 10-4. 7th at their highest, I believe, which what they started the season out in, and as low as 20, but they did rattle off 2 4-game win streaks. Let's get into what they did. Obviously, week 1, they lost in the swamp to Florida. Quite frankly, I think there were a couple games last season where Anthony Richardson, as inconsistent as he was, there were a couple games where he just took over, and he became the top 4 pick that he ended up being. Week 1 against Utah was one of those games. They were simply a victim of Anthony Richardson in week 1 of last season. What did they do? They did unspeakable things to Southern Utah, unspeakable things to San Diego State, Arizona State. This, not talked about a lot. Their win over Oregon State last season, knowing what we know now, that 10-win team that was Oregon State, Utah beating them 42-16 was quietly one of the most impressive wins last season that nobody talked about. Then they lost to UCLA. And keep in mind, at this point, what they have been doing. 73 points, 35 points, 34 points, 42 points. 32 against UCLA. Again,
The Pac-12 last season was incredible. Dominant offenses left and right. UCLA was one of those teams. One of the best offenses in college football last season. They put up 42 on Utah. I don't think there's any shame in losing that game. But people thought so. They dropped them 9 spots. Then they beat USC. The story of Utah last season, with their back against the wall, beating USC. They beat them 43-42, amazing game. And they moved up to 14, where again, Washington State. Again, a very good team in the Pac-12 that they beat. Good win. Back-to-back dominant wins over Arizona and Stanford. They lose to Oregon. Again, the Pac-12 kind of cannibalized each other last season. The reason we didn't have a Pac-12 team in the playoff is because all the top teams beat each other. And Utah had to play most of them. I mean, Oregon State, UCLA, Oregon, USC twice, Washington State. They had it up. They had it. They had it up. They had it against the odds stacked against last season. Then they do unspeakable things to Colorado, and then their crown jewel of last season, beating the brakes off USC in the Pac-12 championship to save us, the college football public, from watching USC make the college football playoffs. Thank you, Utah. I'm not trying to hear any excuses about Caleb Williams being hurt because he threw for 400 yards last season. So he was healthy enough to throw for 400 yards, but not, get blown out by 20. I don't want to hear it. Rose Bowl against Penn State, they lost handedly. Back-to-back years where they win the Pac-12 championship, lose the Rose Bowl to a Big Ten team. Okay, whatever. I mean, it would have been nice if they won that game. A nice conclusion to their season. But, I mean, bowl games, I take them with a grain of salt. So, offensively, quietly, in my opinion, I think a top 20 offense last season. I mean, the MO of this team is running the football, but there are not many teams who are top 15 in rushing yards last game, but are also top 50 in passing yards. They had that mix, which is why they were 17th in total yards. 38.6 points per game, 11th in the country. Did not give up many sacks, 16th in that category. That'll always help an offense. Turning the ball over, though, 18 times, not great, certainly. I mean, for a team that runs the ball as much as they did, that number is way too high for them. For a team that runs the ball first, 18 turnovers is too many. Defensively as well. I didn't know this. I did not know that they were a top 20 offense and defense, because they were, without a doubt, really. 27th in yards per game allowed, 61st in passing yards allowed, not great. 18th in rushing yards, 20.6 points per. Look at the point differential. 18 point per game differential. They beat up on a lot of bad Pac-12 teams, I'll give you that. But an 18-point differential was very, very impressive. 14th in sacks per game, and then 24 takeaways. I mean, across the board, offensively and defensively, a very good Utah team last year. Who did they lose? Tavion Thomas beat somebody. I think he threatened his girlfriend with a knife or something. Thankfully, you could say he's gone, even though he had 20 touchdowns 2 years ago. Nobody will be missing him, I think. Dalton Kincaid, the biggest loss of this offense, without a doubt. Even though he was amazing last season, had 200 yards, I think, against USC one game. We will get into it. I do not think in practice that will be as big of a loss as it is on paper. And then defensively, Gabe Reed, 5.5 sacks, Diabate, 5 sacks, Clark Phillips, their best DB from last season, 6 picks for him. They didn't lose that much, I'll say it. They probably lost their best member of their secondary, their best offensive weapon, but I think all these guys, we'll get into it, I think they can kind of reload with. Offensively, yeah, they got a lot of pieces. So let's get into Cam Rising. Sneakily, one of the best quarterbacks in college football. And the sad thing is, he's not even a top 3 quarterback in his conference, but he's probably a top 7 or 8 quarterback in the country. That's more so just how stacked the Pac-12 is, rather than him not being up to par as far as just QB play, in the country. Micah Bernard, he entered the transfer portal, but they got him back, thankfully. Jaquindon Jackson, converted quarterback to running back. He's a beast. Jalen Glover. The MO of this team, like I said, is run first. They should be able to keep that up, without a doubt. And then the wide receiver core is stacked, really. I mean, Devon Vale, nearly 700 yards last season. Money Parks, 450 yards. Emory Simmons, out of Indiana, I believe, should be a very exciting player to watch. And then Micah Pittman. This is his third team in like 3 or 4 years. Something about that just rubs me the wrong way. I guess he didn't think he could compete at Florida State, so he's out here. I think he's going to be wide receiver 4 at Utah, probably even, just 5 and 6 across the team and targets or whatever. But, I guess he wants to be the 5th option in a Pac-12 team. So, good luck to him. And then tight end, Thomas Yasmin averaging over 20 yards a catch as tight end, just casually. And then 13 catches, 6 touchdowns, by the way, for him. And then Brant Keith, injury prone his whole career. But even though I have him in the bottom right corner of the screen here, this is the guy who's had multiple 600-yard seasons in his career. So this is his 6th season because he has so many medical redshirt seasons, all that shit. If he can stay healthy, he may be the number 1 receiver on this team. So keep an eye on him and the status of his health going into games this year. Defensively, a lot of players here. That's because they're very deep and very versatile on defense. A lot of guys in their front 7 who can get after the quarterback. The list goes on. I got 7 guys here in their front 7. Then in their secondary, they got Miles Battle, got him from Ole Miss. And then look at their safeties down here. Cole Bishop, R.J. Hubert, Sion Baki, Jeremiah Vaughn, 9 passes defended last season. I got 12 players from their defense and 12 players from their offense. I think this is just an incredibly talented team. The only reason I can't put them any higher is that they lost 4 games last season, and I expect them to lose 3 or 4 next season just because of how good the Pac-12 is. Pac-12 is one of the most competitive conferences in the country, probably the most competitive in the country, to be honest, in my opinion, as far as how many top teams there are and how little separation there is between them. I think they're just going to cannibalize each other again, and Utah is just one of the teams in the mix there. I have 4 teams from the Pac-12 in my top 12. So it's so hard to separate them because they're all so talented. They're all so versatile. And even though Utah is the back-to-back Pac-12 champions, I'm putting them at 4th just because I feel like the other 3 teams I have ahead of them are just marginally better in certain areas. That's it. And then number 11, I have Tennessee. Some people are going to be very, very upset that I don't have an 11-2 SEC team in the top 10. At one point, they were ranked number 1 in the country. They started the season unranked. Was there a crazier story in college football in Tennessee last year? No, not at all. 8-game win streak. Let's get into what they did. Starting the season off with 59 points. And you'll notice a theme here. Every game except one, which we will get into, they scored at least 31 points. They were the best offense in the country last season. Let's break it down. 59-point win in week 1. That got them ranked. Then they beat a ranked team in Pitt. Impressive at the time. That got them all the way up to the top 15. Blew out, and look how far they're jumping with each game. Unranked to 24, 24 to 15, 15 to 11. A close game against Florida. That was one of those Anthony Richardson games where he was just balling the whole game. They managed to beat them. Jump up to 8. Dominate the eventual SEC West champions in LSU. This was bad. I watched this game. I thought after this game, LSU was done. I did not think they could compete with teams after what Tennessee did to them. That got them all the way up to 6 for the best game in college football last season. One of the best games in college football history, their win over Alabama. Everybody knows this game. I don't have to spend much time about it. The significance of this game, what it meant for Tennessee, massive, massive win. Dominate UT Martin. Beat the fucking brakes off Kentucky. I'm sorry. For a not great defense to do what they did to Kentucky and Will Levis's bum ass, that was fun to watch. That was rough what they did to Kentucky. Then there was the Georgia game. I think at one point, different websites, this was a number 1 versus number 1 matchup. I think the first in history, certainly the first I've ever seen, and Georgia was a better team. I'm not going to say Tennessee got exposed. Georgia was just the better team. They figured out how to shut down Tennessee's offense, and that's what they did. They held to 13 points. one of the most impressive feats of the college football season last year from Georgia's defense that day. Tennessee lost their first game of the season. Came back and beat the poor brakes off Missouri. And then with the college football in arm's reach, college football playoffs in arm's reach, they blew it against South Carolina. 63 points allowed to Spencer Rattler. Come on. Of all the teams he could have played, Spencer Rattler put up 63 on Tennessee. Hendon Hooker got hurt, and a lot of people thought the season was over. Then Joe Milton comes in and, surprisingly, well, unsurprisingly, they beat poor Vanderbilt 56-0. And then they pulled off a massive win in that bowl game. Imagine how differently their season would have been viewed and the energy around the team if they would have just lost to Clemson. But no, with their backup QB, Joe Milton, they beat Clemson, and now all the hype is surrounding this program because of what they were able to do in their bowl game. Let's get into it. I already said, best offense in the country, most yards per game, most points per game, 46 points per game. I mean, 5th in passing yards, 26th in rushing yards. Obviously, with losing Hendon Hooker, I think this is a team that's going to rely on the run game more than they did last season, which is a scary thought because I think this is a team that can be top 10 in passing and top 20 in rushing. That is a scary, scary thought. I mean, they gave up a lot of sacks, which is, it's kind of skewed because of how much they threw the football. Are they a better offensive line than 65th in the country? Yeah, they probably were last season. Only 11 turnovers. I mean, how do you put the ball in harm's way, per se, as much as they did last season and only have 11 turnovers? It's just so impressive. Props to Hendon Hooker. I think he only had 5 turnovers, or 5 picks at least, in 2 years at Clemson. Or not Clemson, at Tennessee. So very impressive there. Defensively, we know they struggled. But they did, let's get into it. 91st in yards per game. Damn near dead last. They might have been dead last, besides maybe Colorado or something, in passing yards per game. But understand, with the amount of big leads they had last season, other teams had to throw a lot against them to stay in the game. So they probably weren't the 127th best secondary last season, but also they weren't great. 22 takeaways, very nice. Top 25 in the country. 2.38 sacks per. You probably expect them to have a little bit more, considering how much teams had to throw the ball against them. But 22.8 points allowed, 36th. This was not a horrible defense. I mean, just look at what they did versus LSU, versus Kentucky. I mean, hell, they only gave up 27 to Georgia. Sneakily, one of the most impressive defensive performances for them last season. So, obviously, we know what they were last season, but who did they lose? Who made that season so important for them? Hendon Hooker, obviously, we know what he was. Jalen Hyatt, Biletnikoff, Darnell Wright, first team All-SEC. I mean, Byron Young, Jeremy Banks. A lot of people are going to talk about the quarterback and wide receivers they lost. I think losing Jerome Carvin and Darnell Wright, respect to Hendon Hooker and Jalen Hyatt and all them, the pieces of the offensive line they lost might be more important. So, I mean, look at that. 42 starts in his career for Darnell Wright. 43 starts in his career for Jerome Carvin. I think they can replace Hendon Hooker with Joe Milton. I think they can replace some of the wide receivers. Replacing those offensive linemen in 1 year is going to be difficult, if you ask me. And then they also lost their leading sack leader. They're their leading sack getter from last season. 2 linebackers. 4 of their front 7. 2 offensive linemen. That is a big hit to their trenches, if you want to say, offensive, defensive line for Tennessee. Who do they have? Who is the leftovers of the best offense in the country? I'll tell you, it's one of the best offenses in the country. They retained all 3 of their running backs. Like I said, so important. Being able to rely on the run game next season is going to be crucial for them because as good as Joe Milton looked in his 2 games, he is not Superman. I don't think he's going to be Hendon Hooker. I do think he will be a very good quarterback. And this goes into the idea of, is it the system at Tennessee that Josh Heupel runs offensively, or is it the players? Are Hendon Hooker and Jalen Hyatt just that good, or was it the system they played in? We will find out this season. Because Joe Milton, he has the arm, He has the talent around him. This receiving core is good. Dante Thornton, Brew McCoy, Ramel Keaton, Squirrel White. Forget the size of them, the size and the speed of this wide receiver core. Just look at the yards. Dante Thornton over 20 yards a catch. Squirrel White being a deep threat. Ramel Keaton being a deep threat. Brew McCoy, what he did last season. More yards than Cedric Tillman for him, even though Cedric Tillman missed time, obviously. But the tight ends they have. Bringing in transfer portal talent, Dante Thornton, McCallan Castles, both of the transfer portal. So offensively, I expect this to be a top 5, at worst, top 10 offense next season. Okay, that's not the question. The question is, do they try and do it the same way, or does it look slightly different? Is the only question in my mind. Defensively, I don't think it's a great defense, which, to Tennessee's credit, they didn't have a great defense last season. But I cannot say with what they lost. They lost Biletnikoff. They lost one of the best quarterbacks in college football. They lost so much defensively, so much of their offensive line. This defense is not bad. They have 5 DBs there on the right-hand side who I think could be productive. 5 front 7 players on the left-hand side who I think could be productive. It's not a horrible defense, but it's not a good defense. They lost so many players. I have to see it first. I cannot say a team that loses that much is a top 10 team just based off the belief I have in their program. They're not there yet. They had one great season. That is not enough for me to just have confidence that they can replace top-level guys in 1 year that quickly. I cannot believe that yet. I have to see it. They have to prove to me that they can replace top-level talent in one offseason. They very well could. I believe that they will be a very good team next season. Can they beat Georgia? Can they beat Bama? I'm not sure. I'm not predicting that yet. But, it's a to-be-seen thing for Tennessee. And that's why I have them at 11 and right outside the top 10. But that is going to be it for this video. That was a very long video. Top 10 through 5 should be out very, very soon, probably within a couple days. Thank you for watching. If you're still here listening to me at this point, please like the video. I appreciate you staying with me the entire time. Subscribe if you're new. And thanks for watching. Peace.
It's out the motherfucking pack. Right out the niggas don't know how to act.